All right. So moving on, in our talk last time we were talking about David Hume, and today we'll talk a little bit about Immanuel Kant and, in large part, his reaction to David Hume. And through that, we'll get a taste of his metaphysics and epistemology. I put a couple things up here on the board just to make it a little bit easier for us to say. Of course, over here, this is the stuff we want to cover in this lecture. But in terms of our different viewpoints, these are our metaphysical viewpoints. And over here are epistemological. Well, whatever. So you'll recall that empiricism is an epistemological position. Empiricism says we can have knowledge and we gain knowledge through our senses. Ultimately, all knowledge rests on sense experience. And you'll remember John Locke with his tabula rasa. David Hume, of course, that was part of what drove him nuts, right? Was trying to be a very strict empiricist. And typically our empiricists are materialists as well. It makes sense that if you're going to gain knowledge through the world, then the physical world probably exists. That's an underlying assumption of that viewpoint. Berkeley is best understood to be an idealist. Remember, he is skeptical about the physical world and says that all of your evidence for the reality of a physical world rests on mental entities or a mental activity, right? That you don't actually sense it until it makes it to your mind. So what's ultimately real for him, we might want to say, well, it's that physical world that is impressing itself upon us. But as Berkeley points out, your only evidence for that is from your senses, and your senses, that only counts once those sense experiences reach the mind. So ultimately, what is fundamentally real, we can't go that road, Berkeley tells us, because our evidence for it is all in our heads. And so what's ultimately real has to be something non-physical. You can call it an idea if you want. What's the ultimate reality? Stuff in your head. What about the physical world? Well, if it doesn't get into your head, you got no evidence for saying it's real. Epistemologically speaking, Hobbes clearly are a materialist. Because of that, he's going to be an empiricist too. Wasn't really his project, but it was an underlying reality of his viewpoint. Rationalism is the epistemological position. We can come to have knowledge by relating ideas. Now, Locke and Hume, of course, are going to say, well, where do we get those ideas? We get them from sense experience and all that. But the idea is that for Berkeley, of course, since he's skeptical about the physical world, we cannot say that a firm grounding for knowledge is in our sense experience of that physical world. So whatever knowledge is possible is merely the relationships of different ideas. And so that's why we're going to call him a rationalist. You might say Berkeley's position is irrational. That's not really what we mean by rationalist. We don't mean supremely reasonable, although, I mean, you have work to do if you're going to object to Berkeley. So it doesn't necessarily mean perfectly rational. It just means that it's mental entities relating to each other, how ideas relate to each other without regard for the physical world or any exterior entities. So we're going to call Berkeley a rationalist. You should probably know that for a quiz or an exam, just saying. Today, moving on to talk about Kant, there's a question, is Locke is a materialist, but is he also an idealist? He does leave the door open, and he talks that way sometimes. Remember we had said, you know, your tabula rasa, your blank slate, your mind, it has to be something, and it's not physical, because like when you think of an elephant, you don't literally have a physical elephant in your head. So he does leave the door open to a world that is not purely physical, is the best way to put it perhaps. Hobbes and Hume never really want to go down that road. They're so busy trying to ground philosophy and materialism and empiricism that you might be able to make a case for Hume here, but really it's in trying to avoid this that he's run into such big difficulties. Kant, well, frankly, we can probably put Kant all over the place here, and we'll explain why that's true in just a second. I just wanted to give you kind of a breakdown of what we're looking at so far for this second exam it is important to keep these different philosophers separate, to know the difference between Hobbes and Locke, for example. Okay, so moving on. I'm going to go ahead and take this stuff down. You will recall David Hume, when it came to things like space, time, causation, right? These things here that I put up under Kant's categories. Remember what he said about causation. Where do we get the idea of causation? Remember, for Hume, every idea must be a copy of an impression. That an impression is a sense experience. And that's how he's going to ground his epistemology in a really thorough empiricism, right? All ideas, all mental entities must be, in fact, they are nothing more than a fainter copy of a sense experience. And the problem that we ran into there, for me, it's easiest to see when we talk about causation. When we see A happen and then B happen, we don't see the causation in there. There's a certain necessity involved in a causal relationship. It's not just that two things happen, it's that the second thing happened because of the first one. And so, because of that, what we don't actually see with our eyes or ears or whatever, well, we see with our eyes or hear with our ears, is the necessity of that causal connection. So if Hume is right, remember, every idea must be copied from an impression. We have the idea of causation. What's our impression? We don't ever actually see causation. What we see is a sequence. We see the first event and then the second event. What we don't see is that the second event was brought about by the necessity involved in a causal relationship. And so Hume's answer to that is, well, over time, by experiencing A and then B, by experiencing the sequence over and over, when we have the experience of A, we predict or we expect B to happen. And so it's that expectation, it's that habit that we form in expecting the consequence that we call causation. This is a big problem, right? And the problem is, if that's true, then causation happens here, but not out in the world. And that's not what we mean when we talk about causation. When we talk about, something falling and knocking something else over, we're not talking about things that happen in our mind. We're talking about things that happen in the world. So the question then is the world itself actually causally connected, or is it just a conclusion that I draw? And if it's a conclusion that I draw, then it's arbitrary. It's not true about the world. It might be something else. And so this really threatens to undermine the entire notion of understanding the world, right? Because if causation doesn't happen in the world, well, then we can't apply a causal framework to things that happen in the world. And so on. I mean, it's really a big deal. This is why Hume, like we had said before, may or may not have lapsed into skepticism, may or may not have had a nervous breakdown, because he ran into this problem that he couldn't really solve. And he tried for another 250 pages or so to solve the problem. I won't say he gave up, but he said he gave up. He sort of felt like he gave up. Wasn't sure how to solve it. And so maybe we just have to accept what he wrote and say that there really is no causation in the world. It really is just an arbitrary habit of mind that we come to develop. But then here comes Immanuel Kant to save the day, to save literally the whole world. He's going to save all of reality from David Hume's sophistry or whatever. And he thinks that one of the things that David Hume has shown in running into this problem is that we can't rely ultimately just on those sort of experiences. That is, habit isn't going to get the job done. Developing a habit of expecting B when A happens, or as we talked about endurance, right? When you don't see me and then you do see me again, you think I'm the same person. Developing that habit does not show that it's true of the world. It only shows that it's true of our mental states. It means it's arbitrary, and so, like we said, all of the world sort of disappears. We can't rely on anything there. But here's what Kant says. He does give us this distinction, I'll go ahead and give it to you now, of a priori and a posteriori. And we got to be a little bit careful here, because post means after, prior means before, and it's true, but we're not talking about these in terms of time. We're talking about them in terms of logical necessity. So anything that is a posteriori, it means the same thing as the word empirical means. It means based on sense experience. So, a posteriori knowledge would be anything that you gain from your sense experience. I know that this marker is brown because I see it. That's a posteriori kind of knowledge. A priori, on the other hand, is something that he describes as being logically prior to experience. So think of it as the necessary conditions for having the experience. This is going to be his big contribution and the big takeaway with Immanuel Kant. Well, logically prior to experience. Or if you prefer, you might just think of it as something that is divorced from experience, where experience is not necessary. So for example, something like math, he considers a priori knowledge. 2 + 2 is 4. It doesn't require any particular sense experience to make that claim. So that's a kind of an a priori logical deduction. So here's what what Kant says. Kant says if Hume is right, the world is arbitrary, we can have no knowledge of it, and that's a big problem. But he's not right. That is, causation and endurance, things like that, they're not merely matters of habit, even if they are. Even if they are habits, you have to be in a condition to develop that habit. You can't just go around developing habit. So in terms of Hume's explanation of first we see A and then we see B, we notice the sequence, and so we come to expect B every time A happens. We have to be so constituted somehow that we're looking for those kind of relationships, that we take this sequence and develop a habit, make a deduction from it. Well, I guess A cause B, right? So step one, or argument number one, for why Hume fell short is Hume thought we were just making these habits. But Kant points out, before you can develop a habit, you have to be able to develop the habit. So he says, before there is a habit, there must be a propensity. You must have a propensity to develop the habit. You must be in a condition to, when you notice the sequence of A and B, you then can develop the habit of expecting B when A happens. So think about it in terms of things that you can't develop a habit about. We don't sense the world like sharks do, or like bats. We don't do echolocation, at least not very well. And so we're not really in a condition to develop whatever that habits the bats develop. When they hear click, 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 they say, oh, grasshopper. I don't know what bats do. But the point is, we're not in a position to develop that habit. So if we are developing these habits of expecting endurance, right, things continuing to exist even when we don't see them, or persistence, if you like that word better, or causation, the fact that we do develop those habits, even if Hume is right and it is a habit, means that there is something antecedent, something given we bring to the table when we take A and B in sequence and call them causally connected. So, this is a really important point, because if Kant is right about this, the next point is kind of the same thing, only in a stronger sense. But if Kant is right about this, then Locke is wrong, at least in part. Our tabula isn't entirely rasa. We are not born with a totally blank slate, right? For Locke, in the question of nature versus nurture, it was all nurture. And in fact, a whole branch of psychology sort of developed based on that we could train people to be anything, right? So Kant says, well, we must be in a position to develop those habits, and that means that we bring something to the table. So our tabula cannot be completely blank. We bring something to the table. In looking at these space-time endurance causation, play along with me here, a little thought experiment. I would like you, if you would please, to think about a cat. Just imagine a cat. What color is your cat? Cat has to have color. It's clear it ain't a cat. Although clear might count as a color in this case if you want to try that. What's your cat doing? Floating in space? Sitting on the stairs? knocking stuff off the table, chasing mice, I don't know. What is your cat doing? You see, there are certain things that are entailed in trying to imagine even something like that, like a cat, that have to be there. That is, your cat must exist in space. What does it even mean to talk about an object that exists but takes up no space, right? So imagine your cat. Now imagine your cat taking up no space. I don't know what you're imagining, but it's not a cat, right? Maybe you're imagining, you know, the platonic form of cat. I don't know what you want to say, but cats take up space, right? And so we can't imagine a cat that takes up no space. Or forget cat, just think anything in the world. Picture any object and imagine it taking up no space at all. Or, if you prefer, whatever your object is, your cat in this case, imagine your cat existing, but existing for no time. Like, what does that even mean? If you exist for no time, then you don't exist, right? If you exist for an instant, then there's a strong sense maybe in which you don't exist, or at least very brief. That is, time is a necessary condition for talking about existence. To say that something exists is to say that it exists through some period of time. And in terms of physical objects anyway, to say that they take up some space. Like, what would be a table that took up no space? Or a chair, don't get me started. Endurance, causation, all the same thing. That is, what this shows us is these are what Kant calls the a priori, right? The a priori categories of experience. He calls them the categories of reason as well. They're really the same thing. That is, you can't have physical experience, you can't have sense experience that's outside of these categories. And so Kant says, Hume, you may be right that we develop a habit, but we have to develop these habits. We bring it to the table. This is how we see the world. These are the categories through which we experience and understand things. And maybe it's possible that there are things that exist outside of space and outside of time. If so, we can't know about them, because the way we are built is to experience the world in time, in space, causally connected, right? That things continue to exist. It's not merely a habit that we happen to form. It is, in fact, the antecedent necessary conditions for having an experience. And so one of the upshots of this is that Kant tells us that when we experience the world has to meet us halfway, right? When I use the word categories because that's Kant's word, but if you think of them as filters, that's really what he's getting at. That the world has to come to us through these filters. We are born with them, we bring them to the table. This is how we understand things. We will always see the world as causally connected because that is just the kind of creature we are. And we bring that to the table. And in fact, if something happens in the world that is outside of causation, we will still assume it has a cause and reach for understanding what its causes are. Because that is the necessary components of understanding anything. So, for Kant, these categories are antecedent. That means they're first, right? These are the first. They have to be in place in order for us to have any sense experience at all or to understand anything. What would it mean to see something that is not in space? Or to see something that exists for no time? They're meaningless ideas because for us, they're the necessary preconditions of understanding anything. So, really important point. And it's best, for me anyway, to understand this in comparison to, say, John Locke, who says you're born with a blank slate. Kant says, not entirely blank. Things must come to us in certain ways. And if you think of the Locke's blank slate as like a blank whiteboard, you can shine a projector on it and show something. You can write on it. But if you bounce sound waves off of it, you're not going to see anything, right? All right, whatever. Maybe that's not a great example. My point is just that while Locke says that we are born with a blank slate, Hume says things like causation or notions of space and time or endurance are habits that we happen to form. Kant tells us that if Hume is right that they're habits that we can't avoid. We must see the world this way. So these are the a priori categories of understanding anything. So we bring them to the table. If we're going to understand the world must come to us through those filters. If there are aspects about reality that do not come to us through those filters, we will not know about them. And so we have the world as it comes to us through our filters. And we say, Kant says, there is a real world out there. Is it material? Is it ideal? Is it physical? I'm not going to get into that, right? Kant is not going to get into that. What he can say is there is a real world. It does act on us through the filters that we bring to the table to understand it. So he's got this great idea, I thought it was kind of cool, where the world has to meet us halfway. We don't just go out and understand it as it is. It has to come to us in a way that we're able to understand it. So you've got the a priori categories of understanding and reason, the categories through which we must understand the world. And so what is the world like beyond that? What is the world like on seek? Remember on seek? In itself. I get how we understand the world through our experience. That's fine. But what is that real world apart from our experience? In itself, what are its properties? And for this, Kant has to say, we have the understanding we have through our filters. We want to ask, what is it like on the other side of those filters? Don't really know. Now, that is what Kant says. And so in terms of the, is he an idealist or a materialist? He says he's both. He says he is an empirical realist, that is, that there is an actual world out there to experience, and we can come to know it through our senses, but a transcendental idealist, that is, what is beyond our experience of the physical world, what is the underlying reality there? Don't know, but there must be one, right? So he kind of leaves the door open in all those different cases, but one thing he's done is show, he thinks anyway, that the empiricist project, the empiricist/materialist project of grounding all knowledge simply in sense experience, and then, the horrible consequences that David Hume ran into, those horrible consequences are evidence that there's a flaw in that exclusive theory. And so his grand contribution here, and I strongly encourage you to read not the Prolegomena, what's it called? Oh, the Critique of Pure Reason. And if you get more than 5 pages in without chewing your own face off, you can have some extra credit, because that's a really heady book. But he goes through, in the Critique of Pure Reason, he details his argument for why there must be these categories, and while we bring them to the table, the world must meet us through those filters. So, that's Kant's answer to David Hume. I told you, I'll tell you the quick little story. I know we're already kind of long on this video, but I'll be quick. So once upon a time, every day, Immanuel Kant, his students would come to his house and they would smoke tobacco and drink this really strong, nasty tea. And every day at 4 o'clock, Kant would go for a walk. And he was highly regimented like that and whatever. And everybody, I don't know if they loved him, but he was this pious dude and all that. And one day he didn't go for his walk, and his neighborhood freaked out. Oh my God, where's Immanuel? And so this lady called the cops, and they went to Immanuel Kant's house, and there he was. And he had not taken his walk. And they said, oh my God, what happened? Why didn't you take the walk? And he said that he was so engrossed with David Hume's essay concerning human understanding. No, David Hume's treatise on human nature, he had been reading it and lost track of time. So that's how important Hume was. Hume was so important that reading that book made Kant miss his afternoon walk, which was totally unheard of. And of course, Kant did say at that point that it was in reading David Hume's book that awoken him from his philosophic slumbers, because it was so full of crap that somebody needed to step up and correct all these mistakes. That's kind of a pejorative way of putting it. I think he felt a little sympathy for Hume, because Hume was really upset, about not being able to really establish the reality of the world around him. And so Kant said that he thanked Hume for awakening him from his philosophic slumbers, and then he went on to write the Critique of Pure Reason to try to detail all these different variables and correct whatever mistakes he thought Hume had made. And this is how he did it, right? The a priori categories of experience, certain ways that the world must come to us. I leave you with that for now. As always, if you have any questions or you have any concerns or anything, please shoot me an email. I will do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. And until next time, I hope you guys are staying well and doing good things.